There's a moment, a precise and identifiable moment, when the British Empire stopped being the British Empire. It wasn't a treaty, it wasn't a battle, it wasn't some grand ceremony where a flag was lowered and a bugle played. It was a phone call. One single phone call from Washington to London on the 6th of November 1956. And in the space of that conversation, roughly 3 centuries of imperial dominance crumbled into dust. Not because Britain had lost a war, not because its armies had been defeated on the battlefield. In fact, they were winning. But because the United States of America decided to do something far more devastating than drop bombs. Washington decided to attack the British pound. What happened during the Suez Crisis of 1956 is one of the most extraordinary and underappreciated episodes in modern history. It is the story of how a canal in the Egyptian desert became the fault line between the old world and the new. It is the story of how a young Egyptian colonel humiliated 2 fading European empires. And above all, it is the story of how financial warfare, not military force, became the ultimate weapon of the 20th century. A weapon so precise, so devastating, that it brought a great power to its knees in a matter of days. To understand how one phone call from Washington could bankrupt the British Empire in a weekend. You first have to understand why a narrow strip of water cutting through the Egyptian desert mattered so much in the first place. The Suez Canal was not just a canal, it was the jugular vein of the British Empire. Opened in 1869 after 10 years of brutal construction under the supervision of French diplomat Ferdinand de Lesseps, it was an engineering marvel, a 120-mile artificial waterway that connected the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, and from there to the Indian Ocean. Before the canal, a ship traveling from London to Bombay had to sail all the way around the southern tip of Africa, a journey of over 12,000 miles. With the canal, that distance was slashed nearly in half. It was the difference between weeks and days, the difference between profit and loss, the difference between an empire that could project its power across the globe and one that simply could not by the mid-20th century. 2/3 of Europe's oil supply passed through the Suez Canal. The canal was not owned by Egypt. It was owned by the Suez Canal Company, a joint British-French enterprise. Britain was the single largest shareholder, a position it had held since 1875, when Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, backed by a loan from the Rothschild banking family, purchased Egypt's shares in the company from the cash-strapped Egyptian ruler, Ismail Pasha. From that moment on, Britain treated the canal as its own property, and it stationed tens of thousands of troops along its banks to make sure nobody forgot it. For decades, this arrangement worked. Egypt was effectively a British protectorate, and even after it gained nominal independence in 1922, British soldiers remained garrisoned in the canal zone. They lived in sprawling bases along the waterway, a visible reminder that Egyptian sovereignty had clear and uncomfortable limits. It was a humiliating arrangement for the Egyptian people, who had watched 120,000 of their countrymen die building the canal, only to see its profits flow to Paris and London. The canal earned enormous revenues, roughly $100 million a year by the 1950s, and almost none of that money stayed in Egypt. It was colonialism distilled to its purest essence, wealth extracted from the land, and the labor of one nation for the benefit of others. And then along came a man who decided he had had enough. Gamal Abdel Nasser was not born into power. He was the son of a postal clerk from a small town in Upper Egypt, a place far removed from the corridors of influence in Cairo. But Nasser possessed something that no amount of wealth or breeding could buy: an iron will and an almost supernatural ability to read the mood of a nation. He grew up watching the British occupy his country, watching Egyptian politicians grovel before foreign powers, watching the wealth of his homeland drain away through the Suez Canal like blood from an open wound. And he swore that he would change all of it. In 1952, Nasser and a group of young military officers known as the Free Officers Movement overthrew King Farouk, the corrupt and dissolute monarch who had allowed British influence to fester for decades. The revolution was swift, almost bloodless, and wildly popular. By 1954, Nasser had consolidated his grip on power and established himself as the unquestioned leader of Egypt. He was charismatic, fearless, and deeply suspicious of the Western powers who had carved up the Middle East like a Christmas turkey after both world wars. He championed Arab nationalism, the idea that the Arab peoples should control their own resources, their own governments, and their own destinies. And that made him extremely dangerous to Britain and France. Now, Nasser was not just a nationalist firebrand. He was a pragmatist who understood the Cold War chessboard. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a global struggle for influence, and Nasser saw an opportunity to play both sides. He recognized Communist China, which infuriated Washington. He accepted arms from Czechoslovakia, a Soviet satellite state, which alarmed both Britain and America. And he demanded that the Western powers help finance his most ambitious project, the Aswan High Dam, a massive engineering undertaking on the Nile River that would control flooding, generate hydroelectric power, and transform Egypt's agricultural output. The dam was to be the centerpiece of Nasser's modernization program, a symbol of what an independent Egypt could achieve. At first, the Americans and the British agreed to help finance the dam through a World Bank loan. But, as Nasser continued to flirt with the Soviets and recognized Communist China, Washington's patience wore thin. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, a fierce Cold War hawk who saw every geopolitical maneuver through the lens of the communist threat, decided that Nasser had to be taught a lesson. On the 19th of July 1956, the United States abruptly withdrew its offer to finance the Aswan Dam. The British followed suit within hours. Dulles delivered the news with barely concealed contempt, publicly citing concerns that Egypt's economy could not handle the project. A statement that was deliberately designed to humiliate Nasser in front of the entire world. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Dulles and the British believed that pulling the funding would humble Nasser, weaken him politically, perhaps even topple him. Instead, it did the exact opposite. Nasser was aboard a plane, returning to Cairo from a meeting in Belgrade when he learned of the withdrawal. He was furious, but behind that fury was a cold, calculating mind. He had been planning his next move for months, and the Americans had just given him the perfect excuse to execute it. 1 week later, on the 26th of July, 1956, Nasser stood before a massive crowd in the city of Alexandria and delivered a speech that would alter the course of history. For nearly 3 hours, he spoke to the Egyptian people, his voice rising and falling with the cadence of a man who understood the power of rhetoric. He recounted the history of foreign domination. He spoke of the 120,000 Egyptians who had died digging the canal. He condemned British imperialism and American arrogance. And then, embedded within the speech, he uttered a name, Ferdinand de Lesseps, the French engineer who had built the canal. He said the name casually, almost as an aside, but it was not casual at all. It was a code word. The moment Nasser said the name de Lesseps, Egyptian military forces moved simultaneously to seize control of every installation along the Suez Canal. By the time Nasser finished speaking, the canal was under Egyptian control. The crowd in Alexandria erupted. Across the Arab world, people poured into the streets to celebrate. Nasser had done what no Arab leader had ever dared to do. He had seized the crown jewel of a European colonialism and claimed it for his own people. He promised to compensate shareholders at the previous day's closing price on the Paris Stock Exchange, and he declared that the revenues from the canal would be used to finance the Aswan Dam. It was a masterstroke of political theater, and it sent shockwaves through the capitals of Europe. In London, the reaction was apoplectic. British Prime Minister Anthony Eden received the news during a formal dinner at number 10 Downing Street. His guests included King Faisal of Iraq and the Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Said, who reportedly told Eden that Nasser had to be destroyed quickly and completely. Eden needed no convincing. He was already consumed by an almost pathological hatred of Nasser, whom he frequently compared to Mussolini and Hitler. Eden had built his entire political career on the principle that dictators must be confronted, not appeased. He had famously resigned as Foreign Secretary in 1938 in protest against Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement towards fascist Italy. Now, 2 decades later, he saw Nasser as the same kind of threat, a dictator who would grow stronger with every concession, but Eden's judgment was compromised. In 1953, he had undergone a botched gallbladder operation that left him in chronic pain and dependent on a cocktail of amphetamines and barbiturates. Historians have noted that his behavior in the months leading up to the Suez crisis was increasingly erratic, marked by emotional outbursts, poor decision-making, and an inability to sleep more than 5 hours a night. The man who was supposed to be guiding Britain through one of the most delicate diplomatic crises of the Cold War was, to put it bluntly, impaired. Eden's instinct was to use military force to retake the canal immediately, but there was a problem. Britain could not simply invade Egypt. The age of gunboat diplomacy, where European powers could send warships to any corner of the globe and impose their will at the barrel of a gun, was over. The Second World War had fundamentally rewritten the rules of international relations. The United Nations existed. The Cold War was raging. And the United States, Britain's most important ally, had made it abundantly clear that it would not support military action. President Dwight Eisenhower was no anti-imperialist idealist. He was a pragmatist, a former 5-star general who understood power better than almost anyone alive. But Eisenhower also understood that the world was changing. The age of European colonialism was ending, and any attempt to preserve it by force would only drive the emerging nations of Asia and Africa into the arms of the Soviet Union. Eisenhower was also in the middle of a presidential re-election campaign, and the last thing he wanted was to be associated with a colonial war. He told Eden repeatedly, through diplomatic channels and in personal correspondence, that the United States would not support a military solution. Eden heard the words, but he did not listen. What followed was one of the most audacious and ultimately disastrous conspiracies in modern diplomatic history. In October 1956, representatives of 3 nations gathered in a secluded villa in the Parisian suburb of Sèvres. The Israeli delegation was led by Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, accompanied by his Chief of Staff, Moshe Dayan, and Defense Ministry Lieutenant General Shimon Peres. The French sent Foreign Minister Christian Painau and Defense Minister Maurice Bourges-Maunoury, and from Britain came Foreign Secretary Selwyn Lloyd and his deputy, Sir Patrick Dean. Prime Minister Eden did not attend in person, communicating instead through messages, maintaining a thin veil of deniability that would later prove laughably transparent. Over 3 days, from the 22nd to the 24th of October, these men drew up a secret plan. The scheme was elegant in its cynicism. Israel would launch an attack across the Sinai Peninsula towards the Suez Canal. Britain and France would then issue an ultimatum to both Egypt and Israel, demanding that both sides withdraw their forces to a distance of 10 miles from the canal. Since the canal was inside Egypt, this ultimatum was effectively demanding that Egypt surrender its own territory. When Egypt inevitably refused, Britain and France would intervene militarily, ostensibly to separate the combatants and protect the canal. In reality, of course, the goal was to seize the canal, topple Nasser, and restore the old colonial order. The agreement was written up, signed, and given the formal title of the Protocol of Sèvres. Eden was so terrified of its existence that he immediately sent Patrick Dean back to Paris to retrieve all copies and destroy them. The French refused to comply, and the Israelis, who treasured the document as proof of their alliance with Western powers, kept their copies safely locked away in the Ben-Gurion archives. The original British copy was shredded on Eden's orders, one of the most telling acts of a man who knew, on some level, that what he was doing was indefensible. Each of the 3 conspirators had their own reasons for joining the plot. Israel faced an existential threat from Egypt, which had blockaded the Straits of Tiran, cutting off Israel's only access to the Red Sea, and was actively supporting guerrilla raids into Israeli territory. For Ben-Gurion, the war was about survival. France was embroiled in a brutal colonial war in Algeria, and Nasser was openly supporting the Algerian rebels with arms, money, and propaganda. For France, Nasser was not just an Egyptian problem. He was actively undermining French control of North Africa. And for Britain, the canal was everything, the lifeline of the empire, the strategic artery through which oil flowed to fuel the British economy and the economies of Western Europe. But there was one critical variable that all three conspirators either ignored or dangerously misjudged, and that was the reaction of the United States. On the 29th of October 1956, right on schedule, Israeli forces crossed into the Sinai Peninsula. 10 brigades pushed westward across the desert, routing Egyptian positions and advancing rapidly toward the canal. The military operation was brilliantly executed. Israeli forces reached within 10 miles of the canal within days, just as the Protocol of Sèvres had specified. The next day, Britain and France issued their ultimatum, demanding that Egypt and Israel withdraw from the canal zone. Nasser, exactly as everyone had predicted, refused. The trap had been sprung. On the 31st of October, British and French aircraft began bombing Egyptian airfields, destroying Nasser's air force on the ground. The military phase of Operation Musketeer, as the Anglo-French invasion was codenamed, had begun, but in Washington, Eisenhower was livid. He had been blindsided. The British and French had deliberately concealed their plans from their most important ally, launching a military invasion during the final week of the American presidential election. Eisenhower saw the attack for what it was, a colonial adventure dressed up in the language of peacekeeping, and he was determined to stop it. And this is where the story takes its most extraordinary turn. Because Eisenhower did not reach for military threats. He did not send warships to the Mediterranean. He did not even raise his voice, at least not in public. Instead, he reached for a weapon far more devastating than any bomb or bullet. And he reached for the dollar. To understand why this weapon was so lethal, you need to understand the state of the British economy in 1956. Britain had won the Second World War, but the victory had come at a staggering cost. The country was effectively bankrupt. To finance its war effort, Britain had borrowed enormous sums from the United States, from Commonwealth nations, and from anyone else willing to lend. By the end of the war, Britain owed roughly £14 billion in external debts, a mountain of obligations that would take decades to repay. In 1945, the United States extended a massive loan to Britain, $3.75 billion, to help it rebuild. That loan came with strings, and it meant that Britain's financial independence was, in a very real sense, contingent on American goodwill. The British pound sterling was the second most important currency in the world, the anchor of the sterling area, a vast network of nations, mostly former and current British colonies, that pegged their currencies to the pound and held their reserves in sterling. But the pound was fragile. Britain's gold and dollar reserves, the hard currency that backed the values of sterling on international markets, stood at roughly $2.2 billion in October 1956. That sounds like a lot, but it was barely enough to cover a few months of imports. The pound was like a castle built on sand, impressive to look at, but vulnerable to the slightest tremor, and Eisenhower knew it. The moment British and French bombs began falling on Egypt, the tremor started. International confidence in the pound collapsed. Investors began dumping sterling on the foreign exchange markets, and the Bank of England was forced to burn through its precious dollar reserves to defend the currency's fixed exchange rate of $2.80 to the pound. In the first week of November alone, Britain lost $102 million from its reserves, a staggering hemorrhage that brought total reserves down to just over $2 billion. At that rate of loss, Britain would be unable to import food and energy within weeks. The country was staring into the abyss. Harold Macmillan, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the man responsible for Britain's finances, had originally been one of the most hawkish voices in Eden's cabinet, pushing for military action, and even suggesting that Britain should work with the Israelis to destroy Nasser. But now, as the numbers on his desk turned from alarming to catastrophic, Macmillan underwent a dramatic conversion. He went from being the chief hawk to the chief advocate for an immediate ceasefire. The reason was simple. Britain was going broke. Macmillan appealed to Washington for help. He asked the International Monetary Fund for an emergency loan of $561 million to stabilize the pound. He asked the United States Export-Import Bank for an additional $600 million in credit. He asked for American oil supplies to replace the Middle Eastern oil that was no longer flowing through the now blocked canal. And to every single request, Washington said the same thing: no, not until you stop the war. Eisenhower's strategy was devastatingly simple. He deployed 3 coordinated financial strikes against Britain simultaneously. The first was blocking the IMF from providing Britain with its standby credit. The United States was the largest shareholder in the IMF, and nothing happened at the fund without American approval. Eisenhower made it clear that no financial assistance would be forthcoming until British troops were withdrawing from Egypt. The second strike was blocking the Export-Import Bank from extending credit to Britain. This cut off another critical lifeline at precisely the moment Britain needed it most. And the third strike was the most devastating of all. Eisenhower ordered his Secretary of the Treasury, George Humphrey, to prepare to sell the United States government's holdings of British sterling bonds on the open market. The United States owned $3.75 billion in British debt. If Washington dumped those bonds, it would trigger a catastrophic collapse in the value of the pound, wiping out Britain's remaining reserves and potentially destroying the entire sterling area. It would be the financial equivalent of a nuclear strike. The threat did not even need to be carried out. The mere possibility of it was enough. On the morning of the 6th of November 1956, the same day that Eisenhower won his re-election in a landslide, Macmillan went to Eden and delivered the grim news. Britain's reserves could not sustain the current rate of loss. If they did not accept a ceasefire immediately, the pound would collapse, and within weeks, Britain would be unable to import enough food and fuel to feed and heat its own population. Macmillan was blunt. It was ceasefire or national bankruptcy. There was no third option. What followed has become one of the most analyzed phone calls in diplomatic history. Eden called Eisenhower. The conversation was brief and by all accounts deeply uncomfortable. Eden, exhausted, medicated, and humiliated, told the president that he was prepared to accept a ceasefire. But he wanted something in return. He wanted to visit Washington to meet Eisenhower face to face, to try to repair the shattered relationship between the two nations. Eisenhower's initial response was cautiously positive. But within hours, Secretary of State Dulles, who was himself hospitalized with cancers, advised against the visit, arguing it could inflame the Middle East situation further. The invitation was withdrawn. Eden was left with nothing. No canal, no Nasser overthrown, no American support, and no dignity. That afternoon, without consulting the French or the Israelis, Eden announced a ceasefire. British and French troops were literally in the middle of advancing down the canal. They had captured Port Said and Port Fuad and were pushing south. Military commanders on the ground were stunned. They estimated they could have taken the entire canal within 24 hours, but the order came from London, and it was final. Stop. The ceasefire took effect at midnight on the 6th and 7th of November, 1956. The whole military operation had lasted barely 48 hours. The aftermath was swift, brutal, and deeply ironic. Winston Churchill, now retired and watching events from the sidelines, offered his private verdict. When asked if he would have acted as Eden had, Churchill replied that he would never have dared to launch the operation. And if he had dared, he would certainly never have dared to stop. It was a devastating epitaph for a disastrous adventure. Even more remarkable was the reaction in Washington once the ceasefire was in place. Secretary Dulles, from his hospital bed, reportedly asked the British Foreign Secretary Selwyn Lloyd a question that must have felt like a knife in the back. He asked why they had stopped. The implication was clear. If the British were going to commit the sin of invading Egypt, they should at least have committed it fully. By stopping halfway, they had earned all the international condemnation of an imperial aggressor, while achieving absolutely none of their objectives. They had managed, in the words of one historian, to get the worst of all possible worlds. The CIA's deputy director of intelligence was even more explicit. In the middle of the operation, he had told the American intelligence liaison in London, and these words have been carefully preserved in the historical record, to tell the British to either comply with the ceasefire or go ahead with the invasion. What America could not stand, he said, was their hesitation, but by then it was too late. The damage was done. In the weeks that followed, the full scale of the catastrophe became clear. Britain's gold and dollar reserves fell by $279 million in November alone, the worst monthly loss in living memory. The Suez Canal was blocked, deliberately sabotaged by Egypt, which had sunk ships in the waterway to prevent navigation. Oil supplies from the Middle East dried up. Petrol rationing was introduced across Britain in December 1956 and lasted until May of the following year. British families, who had lived through rationing during the war and had only recently begun to enjoy post-war prosperity, found themselves once again queuing for basic necessities. Only after Britain began withdrawing its troops did Washington relent and allow the IMF to release the emergency loan. The $561 million drawing was approved in December, and a standby arrangement for additional support was put in place. The financial crisis was stabilized, but the political damage was permanent. Anthony Eden left Britain for a recuperative holiday in Jamaica in late November, a decision that struck many as absurdly tone-deaf. A prime minister who had just led his country into its most humiliating foreign policy disaster in modern memory was sunning himself in the Caribbean, while his countrymen queued for petrol. During his absence, Macmillan and other cabinet members mechanized to push him out. Eden resigned on the 9th of January 1957, citing ill health, though everyone understood the real reason. He was replaced, in a twist of extraordinary irony, by Harold Macmillan, the very man who had been one of the loudest advocates for the invasion in the first place, who had misread Eisenhower's intentions, who had failed to pass on Treasury warnings about the vulnerability of sterling, and who had then reversed course and demanded the ceasefire when the financial consequences became personally threatening. Macmillan's rise from the wreckage of Suez is one of the great examples of political survival in British history and a reminder that in politics, accountability is often the first casualty. The consequences of the Suez crisis radiated outward like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. For Britain, it was nothing less than the end of empire, not in the sense that every colony was immediately surrendered. That process would take another decade or more, but in the sense that Suez shattered the illusion that Britain could act as an independent great power. The crisis demonstrated, with brutal clarity, that Britain could no longer pursue a foreign policy that contradicted the wishes of the United States. The so-called special relationship, which British politicians had invoked for decades as proof of their continued global relevance, was revealed to be a relationship between a patron and a client, not between equals. When the patron said, "Stop," the client stopped. It was that simple. Macmillan understood this perfectly. As the new Prime Minister, his first priority was to repair relations with Washington, and he did so with remarkable speed and skill. But the price of that repair was permanent subordination. From Suez onward, Britain would never again undertake a major military operation without American approval. The era of British imperial independence was over. For France, the lessons of Suez were different but equally profound. Where Britain concluded that it must never again defy the United States, France concluded the opposite. French leaders, from de Gaulle onward, became determined to build an independent foreign policy, one less dependent on American goodwill. This led directly to France's development of its own nuclear weapons, its withdrawal from NATO's integrated military command, and its persistent suspicion of Anglo-American dominance. The seeds of modern French foreign policy, with its emphasis on strategic autonomy and its occasional willingness to defy Washington, were planted in the ashes of Suez for Egypt and the wider Arab world. Nasser emerged from the crisis as a hero of almost mythical proportions. He had faced down the combined military might of Britain, France, and Israel, and he had survived. It did not matter that his army had been routed in the Sinai, that his air force had been destroyed on the ground, that Egyptian soldiers had been killed and wounded in significant numbers. What mattered was that Nasser was still standing, that the canal was still Egyptian, and that the European invaders had been forced to leave in humiliation. His portrait was hung in homes and shops across the Arab world, from the souks of Marrakech to the tents of Yemen. He became the living symbol of Arab nationalism, the man who had defied the West and won. For the United States, the Suez Crisis established a precedent that would define American foreign policy for decades. Eisenhower had demonstrated that financial leverage could be more effective than military force, that the dollar was a weapon of unmatched precision and power. This lesson was not lost on future American presidents, who would use economic pressure, sanctions, and control of the international financial system to project American power around the world. The Suez Crisis was, in many ways, the birth of the modern American financial empire, a system in which the dollar replaced the gunboat as the primary instrument of geopolitical control. And for the Soviet Union, Suez was a gift wrapped in a bow. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had threatened to rain rockets down on London and Paris if the invaders did not withdraw, and even though it was American financial pressure, not Soviet military threats, that actually ended the crisis. Moscow was happy to take the credit. The Soviet Union positioned itself as the defender of the Arab world against Western imperialism, and this narrative earned it enormous influence across the Middle East and the broader Third World. It was one of the great propaganda coups of the Cold War. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Suez Crisis is the lesson it teaches about the relationship between money and power, between currency and sovereignty. In 1956, Britain was still a formidable military power. Its armed forces were well trained, well equipped, and battle-hardened. Its navy was the second largest in the world. It possessed nuclear weapons. And yet none of that mattered when the Americans decided to attack the pound. Military power without the financial foundation to sustain it was revealed to be an illusion. An empire can survive a lost battle. It can survive a lost war, but it cannot survive a lost currency. The Suez Canal itself remained under Egyptian control. The canal was cleared of wreckage and reopened to international shipping in April of 1957. Egypt operated it efficiently, confounding the predictions of the British and French, who had insisted that the Egyptians lacked the technical expertise to run the waterway. The tolls that had once flowed to shareholders in London and Paris now funded Egyptian development. The Aswan High Dam was eventually built with Soviet assistance and completed in 1970, a decade after Nasser's death, standing as a monument to the independence he had fought for. The United Nations Emergency Force, or UNEF, established in the wake of the crisis, became the world's first peacekeeping force, a concept born directly from the diplomatic efforts of Canadian External Affairs Minister Lester Pearson, who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in resolving the conflict. The idea that the United Nations could deploy armed troops to separate warring parties and maintain peace was a direct product of the Suez Crisis. And it remains one of the most enduring legacies of this turbulent episode. There's a profound and uncomfortable truth embedded in the story of Suez, and it is this: the world is not governed by armies or navies or air forces, at least not in the way that most people imagine. The world is governed by money, by the flow of capital, by the value of currencies, by the willingness of creditors to lend, and the ability of debtors to repay. Britain learned this lesson in the most painful way possible. Standing on the banks of the Suez Canal, its soldiers victorious on the battlefield, its economy collapsing beneath their feet. The greatest empire the world had ever seen was not defeated by a foreign army. It was defeated by a phone call and a threat to sell bonds. And when you think about it, what has really changed? Today, the weapons of financial warfare are more sophisticated. Sanctions regimes, swift exclusions, reserve currency manipulation, frozen assets. But the underlying principle remains exactly the same. Money is power, and the nation that controls the global financial system controls the world. Eisenhower understood that in 1956, and the British Empire learned it the hard way. If this story made you think differently about power, about money, about how empires really rise and fall, then consider subscribing to the channel and dropping a like on this video. There are plenty more stories like this one waiting to be told. Stories about the invisible forces that shape the world we live in. I will see you in the next one.